Good afternoon, and thanks to everyone for joining today's webinar. We're just going to give folks another minute to log in and get connected. So bear with us for 1 second, please. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. So thanks again to everyone for joining today's webinar hosted by Boundary Stone Partners on the Qualifying Advanced Energy Project Credit, otherwise known as the 48C program. Next slide, please. My name is James Pressing, and I'm a vice president with Boundary Stone out of our Washington, D.C. office. I'm joined by two of my phenomenal colleagues, Vice Presidents Lily Green and Allison Kennedy. And we're also incredibly excited to be joined today by Alfred Johnson, who is the co-founder and CEO of Crux, which is a marketplace ecosystem for developers, tax credit buyers, and financial institutions to access the newly created transfer market for clean energy tax credits. Next slide, please. So very briefly, before we get started, a little bit about BSP. We are a one-stop shop for strategic advisory, government affairs, public policy development, federal funding, and strategic communications, with our guiding principle being to combat climate change and accelerate the clean energy transition. BSP was founded by two former chiefs of staff at the Department of Energy and has now grown to nearly 50 employees with experience across all major federal departments and agencies, Congress, and the private sector. We work with nearly 100 clients touching all sectors of the clean energy economy. Next slide, please. So here's our plan for today. We'll start off with a high-level overview of the 48C program before diving into the specifics of what's required in your application and how companies can best develop their projects and position your application for success. Next, we'll spend some time focusing on the community and workforce engagement requirements associated with the program, which is one of the new themes weaved across many of the IRA's tax credits and incentives. We'll then bring in Alfred to share his insights on how the transferability market can unlock innovative financing structures. And time permitting, we'll wrap up with a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So just one quick housekeeping item. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to send them via the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end today. With that, let's get started. Okay. So if you're tuning in today, it's likely you're already somewhat familiar with the 48C credit. Some of you may have submitted a concept paper and are awaiting feedback from the Department of Energy. If that's the case, just up front, I'm sorry, we're not breaking any news today about when you'll be hearing back. But for everybody else, in short, the 48C program provides up to a 30% tax credit on the value of your investment in a qualifying advanced energy project. There are a couple different qualifying pathways here, but at a high level, it is targeted to build out domestic manufacturing projects and incentivize investment upstream in clean energy supply chains. We'll talk a bit more about what those projects are, but first, a little bit of history. 48C program was actually first established by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009. At that time, they issued nearly $2.3 billion of credits in two rounds between 2009 and 2013. So fast forward to August of 2022, where the Inflation Reduction Act recapitalized the 48C program by funding it with $10 billion in new tax credits, and also expanded the list of eligible projects and technologies that it could cover. Aside from being over a decade old, there are a couple other ways in which this credit differs from the majority of the other tax credits created or modified by the IRA. First, this is a $10 billion program, which means that once those funds are allocated, that's it. Nearly all of the other tax credits in the IRA are uncapped. Excuse me. Which means that technically there's no upward limit on the quantity that can be claimed or issued. What this means in practice for companies is that applying for the 48C credit is a highly competitive process. Companies should approach the 48C program much as you would think about applying for a federal grant, and not just like you would claim another tax credit when you file your returns. The program is also very much a joint undertaking between the Department of Energy, the Treasury Department, and the IRS. with each agency having a distinct and important role to play in the process. So when we say this is a competitive process, a couple numbers to put that in perspective. A decade ago, Department of Energy received nearly 600 applications and ultimately recommended that the IRS issue credits to roughly 200 projects built by 130 companies all across the country. Demand is even higher this time around. In the first round of the revised 48C program, DOE made $4 billion of credits available. Applicants requested more than $42 billion worth of credits under this program. So put another way, demand was more than 10 times oversubscribed. So another important factor to consider here is that the guidance released so far not only clarifies the projects that are eligible, but also lays out the specific technologies that the Department of Energy will be prioritizing when it makes its recommendations to the IRS. So while the 3 eligibility pathways that you see here are pretty expansive, in the first round, we expect DOE to give more favorable weightings to a few sectors. That includes hydrogen, grid upgrades and transmission projects, heat pumps, electric vehicles, nuclear, solar, sustainable aviation fuel, and wind projects. Next slide, please. So as we said, there are literally hundreds of pages of information that have been released by the DOE, Treasury, and IRS on the 48C program so far, and its associated requirements. The primary documents are IRS notices 2023 TAC 18 and 2023 TAC 44. So critically here, another massive change that the IRA made is that it conditions the full 30% tax credit on applicants satisfying certain prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements for the project. Otherwise, the tax credit will cap out at 6%. There are a number of guidance documents and proposed regulations that have been issued on the specifics. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And one final undercurrent that's woven throughout the IRA is the focus on so-called energy communities, or those that are particularly affected by the energy transition. Whereas some IRA credits incentivize the development of projects in these areas through the addition of a 10% bonus credit, the 48C program took a different approach and instead requires that 40% of the credits in the program be allocated to these communities. With that, I'll turn it over to Lily.
Thanks so much, James. So I'm going to walk us through what some of the more logistical details are in this process. So first, what to expect. As we've mentioned, we already know that the DOE opened funding applications for round 1 of the funding as concept papers, which closed in August of this year. If you did not submit a concept paper for round 1, you will not be eligible to submit a full application for round 1, but round 2 is expected to open in early to mid 2024. So where we're at currently, DOE is in the process of reviewing concept papers under round 1 and pending, they're actively reviewing and will be imminently providing letters of encouragement, or so we hear, to applicants the DOE believes should be applying for the full application. And I want to take a moment here to draw the distinction or the similarities again between this tax credit application process and a traditional grant process. So because this program has been so oversubscribed at the concept paper stage, DOE uses what they call letters of encouragement. So they review the concept papers for merit, and then they send letters of encouragement to those projects that they think should be applying to the full application stage. If you do not receive a letter of encouragement after the submission of your concept paper, does not mean you are no longer eligible to apply for the full funding. It just simply means that you will face a uphill battle to receive that funding. So that is round 1. Full application design and review will be coming once those they release the letters of encouragement, and then applicants will have 52 days to submit their full application. So what happens after the application phase? So as James mentioned, this is a joint effort between the DOE and the IRS. So DOE will be providing recommendations to the IRS regarding the acceptance or rejection of each 48C application, and they will also be ranking those applications. This is the very, very involved process. So for round 2, what can you do right now if you haven't applied for round 1, but you're waiting for round 2? Right. So there are still many steps that you can take to better prepare yourself to submit an application under round 2, such as finalizing site selection if you haven't done so already. And BSP can help with that. We recently launched a partnership with the global real estate advisory firm Savills that can help you identify sites based on a whole set of parameters and criteria, for example, existing energy communities. And if you're interested in that, please reach out. We'd be happy to share any additional information on those specific location services. Additionally, you can start preparing yourself to submit a concept paper. And so we can help you start gathering the data needed and beginning to articulate a specific narrative and gathering that supporting documentation needed for the concept paper phase. For both rounds 1 and round 2, BSP is also able to support you with your full application submission. The specifics I will get to in a little bit. And we can also help you with your credit monetization strategy, with which Alfred from Crux, who's also here, is going to touch on in a little bit as well. So now moving on to a little bit of, practically speaking, what does any type of BSP support for these types of applications look like, right? So traditionally, we start with a deep dive to help better understand your company, your technology, and your business objectives. The 48C application is unique in that it's not a technology or sector specific credit, but rather it's tech agnostic and was designed by Congress to be a catch-all under the IRA. So as James mentioned at the top, we have those 3 specific areas of focus: clean energy manufacturing and recycling, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and then processing, refining, and recycling of critical materials. Oftentimes, what we've seen is companies can fall into either one or more of those buckets, or they have potential projects that could fall into one or more of those buckets. BSP can really help you provide you with that strategic guidance and targeted feedback to better position your specific application for success within each of those 3 major categories. We're also able to help develop a narrative that will clearly enable you to demonstrate to both the DOE and the IRS, which doesn't have a lot of technical expertise in these specific areas, how your project is going to be advancing the goals of the specific category that you are best suited to apply for. So essentially, we help you take the guesswork out of it, where you look at these options and say, well, I don't know, this project could fit, it couldn't fit. You can come to us and we can help you narrow down that field. Additionally, one of our strengths here is also project management. So we have cross-sector experience with DOE funding applications, which again, the 48C application very closely mirrors. Applying for federal funding can be a very daunting task, and we aim to take the anxiety out of applying for federal funding so you all can get back to doing what you do best, which is running your business and reducing emissions. And finally, again, we can also provide site selection services through a partnership with Savills. And finally, here are some specifics of what you can expect from a full application, right? So the full application will be similar to submitting a grant application. DOE is expecting the same level and quality of this information as if it were a cost share scenario. A majority of the application weight will be given to the technical volume. And this is the 30-page technical volume where you're going to explain your concept, how it achieves the 4 main criteria this credit was designed to incentivize: commercial viability, greenhouse gas reduction, strengthening supply chains and domestic manufacturing, and workforce and community engagement. Finally, one very important flag is the qualitative data sheet. So a version of this was included during the concept paper, but the qualitative data sheet for the technical volume for the full application will require very specific information. So again, we are recommending everybody start pulling together that information now so you can better prepare to submit either your concept paper for round 2 or your full application under round 1. Finally, the workforce and community engagement plan, which is new for funding out of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA, it actually deserves its own spotlight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison Kennedy, who is going to walk us through the specifics of the workforce and community engagement section.
Thank you, Lily. So the workforce and community engagement section is somewhat of a new and growing priority across the administration and the federal government. As Lily said, it was outlined in the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. that that most funding that is coming out of the federal government will require this. At the Department of Energy, they often call it a community benefits plan. So if you see materials on that, don't be discouraged. They are very similar. However, with 48C, there really is the focus on the workforce. This is, as Lily laid out, one of the 4 key criteria that DOE will be evaluating your application on. And so what we can do through our partnership is we really sort of help determine how your project will align with DOE's 4 priority policies, which is job creation and workforce continuity, ensuring timely project completion through workforce and community engagement, energy community transition, local environmental impacts. These are 4 very big buckets and can be somewhat overwhelming. And so we, through our project deep dive, we also have a questionnaire that we work with you to answer and really dive into how your project aligns with these 4 priorities. We really want to make you not stressed out about this. This is very much an important part of your project, but also really, you can think of it as de-risking your project, making sure your community is really involved, making sure your workforce is really involved, and showing DOE how you are exercising and involving your community. Also, once we've done sort of the questionnaire, we will help you with original drafting. We take the answers from the questionnaire and really sort of flesh them out. And this is an iterative process because we'll go back and forth with questions we have with you to make sure you and your team are really involved in this process. With that, I will kick it over to Alfred.
Great. Thanks for having me. We can advance to the next slide here. So I'll do a few slides on Crux, what we do, and then James and I will have a brief conversation on how it intersects with 48C. Briefly on the context here, the IRA makes substantial use of tax credits across categories. It makes them more generous for the projects, introduces more certainty, provides more categories of credit, and then creates a brand new market around transferability and in some instances, direct pay. To put the market size in context for a moment, the tax equity market, which is the precedent structure by which credits have been monetized, where investors in tax equity structures had to be investors in the project level in order to be monetized the credits. That is an $18 billion market in 2022. The anticipated volume of supply across all 12 federal credits that can be monetized by 2031 is 83 billion. So the market is going to grow pretty dramatically across all categories, including 48C. Next slide. With the much larger market, there's going to be a lot more fragmentation. So we're going from a world with hundreds of projects that receive tax equity on an annual basis and 10 to 40 reliable providers of it, to a world with tens of thousands of projects, credits that are divisible, meaning they can be sold in different pieces. They can only be sold once, but they can be split in different pieces, and the need for thousands of buyers on the other side of the transaction. Next slide. What do we do? We're the ecosystem for developers, tax credit buyers, and intermediaries to transact and manage the transferable credits. There are 2 pieces to that. One is workflow software that reduces costs and headaches to transact, so make it easier to list your credits for sale, intake bids, manage the process to share information and close. And then we're building the fastest growing network of buyers, sellers, and intermediaries around that tool set. That's it for slides. James, over to you on questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alfred. And again, thanks for the recap on the transferability market. I think that's one of the areas created by the IRA that we're particularly excited about for exactly unlocking the optionality that you talked about there. But I wanted to spend a few minutes now kind of tying back the interactions of the transferability market with the 48C program in particular. So, we started off talking kind of in depth about what goes into applying for the 48C tax credit award and the associated time and resource requirements. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the IRS will require from companies that want to sell their credits? Is this another heavy administrative lift for companies?
So I think, James, the administrative lift associated with these credits specifically relative to other kinds of credits is not meaningfully different. The bulk of the administrative burden around 48C is around what we've just talked about, the application and the award generation process here. Once an applicant has been accepted and has a 48C credit to sell, they'll follow a similar process to other credits. And what that looks like is the owner of the credit will go to the IRS and get a pre-registration number associated with the credit. They will then file that registration number on their return, and the buyer will also file it on theirs after transfer. There are some rules that apply to ITCs broadly that are applicable to 48C. So for example, the buyer is subject to the risk of recapture. And I think in 48C, given that the step up of the basis of the value of the project is probably less relevant than it is in other credit categories, I think the principal recapture risk here would be associated with the project being taken out of service. And in that sense is applicable, and companies that have 48C that are selling them will need to think about the management of that risk to buyers that may be buying them. And then secondarily, James, the credit is horizontally divisible. So it can be sold in many different pieces, but it can't be split by risk stratification or some other vertical consideration. And so in that sense, the credits can be chunked up in different pieces and sold via marketplace like Crux, but they have to be proportional to the risk in the structure. I think those are the principal administrative things and risk-related things that people will need to think about with 48C.
No, thanks so much, Alfred. I think maybe, one key takeaway I have from that answer is that, some of these issues you have to work through in the tax credit space, such as the recapture risk, are not unique to the transferability market. It's simply a risk that you have to manage regardless of how you'd attempt to monetize that credit.
Yeah, and this starts to relate to questions on pricing, which I think is where you're going to go next here. But given the fact that the government, for purposes of 48C, will have approved an award, I think it stands to reason that the perceived recapture risk associated with these credits might be less in the market. We haven't seen any price yet, but you do have a little bit of like preemptive imprimatur from the government that you don't have in the case of other credits.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that really gets down, to the question that most companies applying to this program really want to know, which is how much can they sell their credit for? So I think I just heard you say we haven't seen any of these particular transactions clear for 48C yet, but how are you seeing this market take shape more broadly?
So the market is just forming now. Obviously, it became legal to transact under Section 6418 on January 1st of this year. But for practical purposes, no transactions happened until after Treasury put out the transferability guidance over the summer. We're now seeing quite a lot of deals price and close in the back half of 23 here. Some general heuristics, we're seeing higher volume credits, so credits that are associated with larger projects, are getting a premium to smaller projects. There's definitely a category of credits that are sub 10 or 5 million, where the pricing is substantially deteriorated by virtue of the credit size. The other condition that is leading to credits in the ITC world being treated less favorably is newer and more novel technologies. I think with Section 48C credits, noting that we haven't seen any yet, I think you might see a similar stratification where larger credits might be expected to sell at a premium to smaller credits. We don't know exactly where that pricing will land, but my guess would be on a net basis for 48C, you'd see pricing for large credits in the 89 to 90 cent range, and for much smaller credits at the lower 80s, maybe 81 to 85 cent range. But of course, that will bear out. And another factor here will be how much demand there is in the market holistically for transferability. And we're seeing early indication that a lot of buyers are coming to this market.
Thanks. I think you hinted at this timing question a little bit in your last answer, but how should a company be thinking strategically about monetizing these credits, particularly in this program where the facility may not be completed and placed in service for up to 4 years in the future? And so, what unique financing structures are you seeing emerge for these credits that will be generated in future years versus a more straightforward production style tax credit that's being earned in real time today?
Yeah, so 48C has this interesting dynamic in that you have to go through the government approval process, you have to get the award, the duration from award to the time that the credit is earned may be longer On the other hand, the dynamic that we observe in the market is similar to other ITCs, where the developer effectively has a receivable, which is the tax credit that they will monetize in the future. There is currently a market for what's called tax equity bridge finance. So people lending, banks and other lenders lending against the tax equity that may be coming into the investment structure and provide a takeout for the loan that is made in precedence of that tax equity coming into the structure. I think we're going to see an emerging market here in what is basically the factoring of the tax credit receivable and bridge finance against the future receipt of the monetized funds associated with selling a 48C credit. So that market is just beginning to form. We're starting to see lenders come to the table, certainly at the quantums of credit volumes that are anticipated in the market. I think you will see additional lenders look to lend specifically against known offtake. And again, given that 48C is associated to a specific award amount, it seems like a good fit for that kind of bridge finance product.
No, thanks so much. I think it's a fascinating space. I think we're clearly going to see new structures emerge, new transaction strategies come to the market. And again, as we kind of led with earlier, it's just very clear there's a number of strategies out there that companies should be thinking about when it comes to monetizing the value of these credits. Obviously, some companies will have the tax base to utilize that credit internally. There's the traditional tax equity structure that has been moving now, and the market is pretty well developed around, but lots of questions. I think a lot of learning by doing to happen in this space still. But fortunately, we have companies like Crux that have kind of jumped into this space to help make it easier for people as this new market emerges. So we're really excited about that. So with that, I think we'll pause on our section of the presentation and turn to a few minutes of Q&A.
Thanks, James. And just while we still have Alfred, one of the questions that we did just receive is, and I think you just answered this, so they just took it back, but it was where does this market exist and how can they use it? So we're very appreciative to have you here. One thing, we got a question about whether or not we'd be sharing these slides. We will be making this webinar recording available online, so you'll be receiving a link after this. We have a few specific questions on which projects sort of qualify. One is, are domestically manufactured energy storage or battery components eligible under 48C? I will look at James to answer that.
Yep, thanks, Allison. I can take that one. So I think, I think as Lily said, 48C is generally we view it as a catch-all credit. So the eligibility criteria are pretty broad. So to your question, energy storage or battery components are squarely within the eligibility crosshairs for the 48C program. I think both for kind of standalone utility style energy storage systems, but also depending upon exactly what you're manufacturing, energy storage, battery, and associated components for electric vehicles as well. So both pathways, regardless of what you're making, are eligible for a 48C.
And also adding to that, someone asked the question is, can the tax credit be applied to solar VPP energy aggregation projects? And I would say, similarly to how you just answered, yes. But the specifics of your project, you have to go through sort of an eligibility review. One thing, is there a FOA number associated with the 2 intake rounds? There is for the first round. It's not sort of a traditional FOA number, but there is a 48C exchange that you can get to from energy.gov, but we will be happy to include the link in our follow-up materials. Someone asked whether or not DOE will talk to applicants during concept review process or in preparation for the full application. As we've mentioned, this is similar to a traditional funding opportunity, and no, DOE will not speak to you about your specific project application. Having been at DOE for almost 8 years, I know that we would love to talk to you, but we don't ever want to show favoritism. So you can still talk to them about other things, but your specific application, they will not answer any questions to protect all of the applicants. And then someone asked, Alfred, can you repeat the rough pricing you're expecting for the tax credits?
Yeah, so in general, right now, we're seeing the highest grade credits in the market, which would be like PTCs sold by investment grade counterparties. Those are pricing at 95, 96 cents. We're seeing small ITCs, like ones associated with community solar, CNI solar, resi. That's trading, it can trade as low as 80 cents on the dollar. My anticipation for 48C credits would be that the stratification would mostly be on size. And so what I quoted was at the $50 million and above size, somewhere around 90 cents net to the developer. And for smaller credits, 48C credits, I would expect that those would, based on today's pricing, trade in the low to mid 80s. But it will depend on what the vibrancy of the credit market is that you're selling into at the time, which is mostly derivative of how much demand we're able to bring into this new market. And early signs here are positive in 2023, but obviously there are factors at play like the tax base of the United States and how strong the economy is that will flow through into credit pricing when these credits come to market.
Thanks, Alfred. And the last question we have is, do you know when the second round concept papers are due? We have not been told. The first round of concept papers were due at the beginning of August. We're still waiting to hear who's getting the next phase for the full applications. As DOE has sort of said, they anticipate sort of early 2024 to release the next round of applicants, but we are very closely watching to see when that actually happens. To that, James, to wrap us up.
Yep. Thanks, Allison. And maybe just one more kind of finer point to put on that last question, in addition to the timing piece. We talked a little bit earlier about there's a bucket of eligibility criteria, and then there's a list of prioritized projects and technologies in this first round. That the eligibility criteria will stay the same for the second round, but it is possible that the prioritized projects and technologies shift and are adjusted somewhat based upon the response that comes in the first round and kind of the ongoing effort from the administration to identify supply chain gaps, in the domestic clean energy manufacturing base. So another thing, we can definitely draw some lessons from this first round, but things may move and shift a little bit as we head into the second round of the 48C program. But with that, we want to thank everybody for carving out just over half an hour of your time with us this afternoon. Thanks to Alfred for joining in particular, to Lily and Allison for your great insights and information. Hopefully this was useful to everybody who dialed in. And if you have questions that did not get answered today during the course of the webinar, please feel free to email any of us directly, and we'll be happy to get answers back to you as soon as possible. With that, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and have a great week. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.